Hey everyone, I think we are live, coming to you live from EnergyCAP. Welcome to our presentation today on the State of Decarbonization 2025. Really glad to have you all with us. The interesting thing about LinkedIn Live is we have no idea who's here, who's tuned in. It's a little bit of a black box for us. So if you don't mind, in the comments, letting us know where you're dialing in from today. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items, but I'd love to see, we can see your comments. So we can't see who's logged in, but we can see who's commenting. So feel free to just drop in and let us know where you're calling in from as we give these housekeeping items in a few seconds. Awesome. So this webinar will be recorded and it will be live or available to watch here on LinkedIn or from energycap.com in our resources section at your leisure. Or if you want to share it with a friend, please do so. And if you do have any questions, oh, it's awesome. I'm seeing some of your locations come in: Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Arkansas, Alexandra, Castle Rock, Colorado. This is great. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat. We can, we'll definitely have time to get to all the questions at the end of the presentation, but we may be able even to iterate and get to some questions throughout the presentation as we go. So don't be shy. Feel free to drop in questions and to connect with each other, right? That's the other great thing about LinkedIn is you guys can talk amongst yourselves. So with that, I'll give a little intro about myself. My name is Amber Artrip. I am the VP of Marketing here at EnergyCAP. We'll talk more about EnergyCAP later, but I'm so glad to be joined here today by Connor Taylor, who is an analyst at Verdantix. And I'm going to let Connor do a little intro about Verdantix.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Amber, and really my pleasure to be here. I believe in our second State of Decarbonization webinar we've done over the years. So I come from Verdantix, so a market research and advisory firm, focusing essentially on different business streams that impact sustainability and decarbonization. In fancy terms, we act as an essential thought leader for world-enhancing innovation. Our different sort of research practices span from net zero and decarbonization, which is where I operate, to ESG and sustainability, smart buildings, operational excellence, et cetera. So yeah, very happy to be here.
Awesome.
Next slide, please, Amber. Thank you very much. A little bit about me. I'm a senior analyst in the net zero team, recently actually rebranded to the net zero energy transition team, which is very pertinent for what we're going to be talking about today. I've been covering the space for about 7 years, both from a software perspective and as an independent analyst. In my day job, I focus my research on carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, and environmental commodities more generally, different areas of climate change consulting services, also relating to the energy transition, as well as the software space more broadly. And a quick disclaimer from us: Verdantix doesn't particularly endorse any vendor mentioned in the materials. We are independent. Our surveys are, again, independently done from a range of different perspectives and thought leaders that we interview, and any opinions expressed are our own.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Connor. And I'll just hit the agenda real quick of the topics that we're going to speak to today. So EnergyCAP conducted a survey of our second version of this survey that we're going to walk through some of the trends that we identified when it comes to the state of decarbonization, the state of our industry. So we'll walk through those trends and we'll validate those trends with Verdantix research. That's why Connor is here, because we don't want to say, you know, our research is it, this is the truth, but we want to validate it and see what else is going on in the market and make sure that those things are accurate. We'll talk about how things are shifting from some carbon reporting and mandates to operational efficiency and bringing it back into operations. How can we make our operations more efficient? And then we'll talk about how software can help and trends that we're seeing in software adoption to support these initiatives. So we'll talk a little bit about the survey that we conducted just a few months ago that led to the report, which is the State of Decarbonization report for 2025, we surveyed 114 energy and sustainability leaders across different industries representing higher education, government, retail, and many other commercial segments. And as I mentioned, this is the second time we've done this survey, which is really interesting because we're starting to see some period over period trends. The last time we did the survey was back in 2023. And so it is interesting to see how things have either rose in priority or decreased in priority, et cetera. So we'll be calling those out throughout the presentation. So let's get to our first trend that we identified in the EnergyCAP survey that we conducted around goal setting in decarbonization. What we see in our 2025 results is that there's 62% of organizations who have defined decarbonization goals. This is fantastic. However, there's over a third of those who are committed to specific deadlines. So putting hard deadlines on those goals, which is great. We love to see it. We do also know that there's still 38% of organizations who haven't established those climate goals yet. So that's an interesting note. At least they're not formalized goals. But when we look at the period over period comparison from our results back in 2023, I think the positive thing to see here is that it has increased. The definition of goals and folks who have actually committed to carbon or climate goals has increased by 7 percentage points period over period. So that's a great trend to see. And I'm going to pass it off to Connor to share what they're seeing on the Verdantix side.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's always really interesting to talk about goal setting, target setting. I think for me, it's one of the sort of the defining features of the last sort of 5 or 6 years of decarbonization trends. Before that, I think the space in general was very much, we're going to be carbon neutral, we're going to offset everything. And then in about 2019, we had the emergence of SBTi, science-based targets. Let's have a Paris Agreement, 1.5 degree aligned decarbonization target. And I've got two sides of the story to tell here. Our own survey, similar sort of respondent base and similar industries surveyed, looking at commercial industries rather than sort of public organizations or government, but global. And in this case, with 353 respondents, showed quite a positive view that firms felt that they were going to hit their emissions targets. This can be a little bit difficult to read, but essentially anything that's yellow or orange basically shows a high degree of faith that they're going to hit their targets. And there's two sort of points to note here. Short-term targets, that's your interim target if you're going by SBTi, somewhere to sort of put a stick in the mark in the achievable future with regards to decarbonization. Long-term target, that's typically going to be a 2050, 2040 net zero goal. There's a bit of a change though, I think. In general, firms are more confident they're going to hit the long-term targets and the short-term targets, bearing in mind that a lot of the employees who probably have set these targets and are working towards a short-term target, they're going to have to pass on to the next generation to see that through. But if we go to the next slide, I think there's a bit of a different viewpoint emerging here. This data is from the Net Zero Tracker. It's a publicly available database run by a non-profit. And not only does it tell you corporate, government, and regional targets and how the progress they're making towards that, it also gives you insight into the different decarbonization plans of the largest 2,000 companies globally, many of whom, of course, are headquartered in the US. And it shows quite a disparity in terms of how people are setting targets, whether they feel they're actually going to achieve them from a macro view. I mean, if we look at Walmart there, very much recognized as one of the leaders in the climate space. They've got an interim target in 2025, and a lot of firms do. I spent some time going through the database of all 2,000 companies. It's something like 20% of firms who have set a target have got an interim target set in 2025 or 2026. So next year is going to be a big reckoning for these firms. But we do see a bit of divergence in how people are setting targets, what they actually want to achieve. We see zero emissions, we see net zero, we see carbon neutrality, we see emissions reduction targets in terms of what sort of targets they're setting. And that sort of confusion about best practice and what firms they can actually think they can achieve still very much defines the market. Not every firm is on the same decarbonisation pathway or has the same level of ambition. And you'll also see, and we'll speak about Scope 3 in a little bit, a various traffic light system from red to green to orange in terms of what sorts of Scope 3 is being covered in that. Scope 3 being indirect emissions associated with your value chain, and essentially in many ways outside of your own locus of control as a business. Next slide, please, Amber. And some analysis, I guess, of why there's a lot of difficulty in the target setting space. I think if we harken back to the 2019, 2020, 2021 days, the whole race to net zero, right? There was this agreement that private sector actors had to work together to set targets aligned with a 1.5 or ideally below degree warming scenario by 2050. And that's what these firms sort of put their strategic planning against. And I think really the birds have come home to nest on this. We're nearly essentially at 1.5 degrees. If you look at least in the UK, that Met Office data on the top right, we're very close to approaching it. Probably by spring, summer next year, we'll already be at 1.5. And that throws a lot of confusion into what the targets actually meant. They're not even achievable now based on this scientific understanding of what firms should be doing. And then there's a lot of volatility in the voluntary action space. SBTI has come under fire in many ways. That was the sort of the leading organization helping firms decide what was an appropriate level of ambition when they're thinking about deciding decarbonisation strategies, financing them. Lots of people are withdrawing from the SBTI. 240 firms in March this year actually said, no thanks, we're not going to do SBTI net zero. As you can see there, including Microsoft, P&G, Unilever, and Walmart. And then let's say some of the more emissions intensive firms who realistically were never really going to hit their emissions targets anyhow, such as Shell, have also abandoned it. So we're getting this sort of weird mix of firms wanting to demonstrate ambition, set targets, and use that as a sort of a North Star to decarbonize, but facing a lot of issues in doing so, some of them which are out of their control. Next slide, please, Amber.
Yep. So this is where we kind of talk about, it's interesting. We're seeing some goals being set, but we're also seeing some people shift around the priorities of those goals. And Connor kind of touched on it. Scope 3 is becoming less and less important, and operational performance is becoming more and more important. But we want to understand first, like, what is driving, this decarbonization within organizations. And what we continue to see from the previous survey and our most recent survey is that long-term viability and regulatory compliance is the primary driver, with over 50% of organizations listing those two as kind of the top drivers. I think the other interesting thing to note to this point is that what we see period over period, the only trend we see actually is that altruistic organization initiatives has kind of dropped in the priority ranking, and reputational risk has risen, which I think is kind of spot on to what we're seeing in the market. Like, people are caring more about risk is becoming more and more important to business viability. So we're seeing that more and more. Passing it back to you, Connor.
Very interesting. We always ask a similar question in our surveys year on year. And this year was the first time that a compliance-focused mindset and approach to climate change strategy really sort of took ahead of some of the other drivers behind this. We also see competitive advantage, which I would equate to this long-term business viability, which you guys found in your survey as being the second most important driver, almost equal, to be honest. And I think it's quite important to note that these two sort of are not necessarily mutually exclusive, although my pie chart might make it look like that, right? Compliance, looking to be advantageous. I think all these things sort of come together into a nexus of why firms are trying to decarbonize. Compliance is obviously a material business risk, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that compliance cannot be a business advantage. If you have the best disclosures, if you have the best performance, even if they're in a compliance framework like the CSRD, really the lines become blurred. And especially over here in the European market, that's something that we're definitely predicting for next year, that even though firms are disclosing in a mandatory context, that's just going to be the new sort of arena for competition to show how well firms are doing in some of these decarbonisation initiatives. Next slide, please, Amber. Thanks. And in terms of, so this is a question we ask every year again at the beginning of the year, asking what's most likely to increase ambition, activity level, but ultimately what we're getting at there is spend. Regulations come at the top, which is sort of a consistent narrative with the last few data sets we've seen. But in general, there's a few sort of typical things going on here. Push from the CEO, push from the board. Those aren't, again, mutually exclusive. That's just how essentially money is being spent in the overall direction going on there. What's interesting for me is that there's a bit less on the sort of push from customers and I guess the direct, let's say, benefits which are traditionally associated with decarbonisation. We've seen in general over the past 2 years a massive lack of interest and in some cases regulatory pressure to not say, okay, we're selling net zero products, net zero services. It's very difficult these days to use your carbon footprint, whether of your organization or of a product, as a sort of competitive marketing tool on that. And customers haven't really aligned their spending with that in general. And next slide, please, Amber. There we go.
Yes. And so then we wanted to understand how many people are involved and engaged in ESG and decarbonization efforts at these organizations who are prioritizing it. And what we found is that on average, there are 6 employees involved in decarbonization at any given organization, with 37% of our respondents reporting having 10 or more people involved. What I find really interesting about this is it's great to see more and more folks getting involved, but what we're seeing at EnergyCAP is that it's bringing teams together who previously maybe weren't collaborating as much. So we've got IT teams coming together with sustainability teams, coming together with facilities teams and finance teams. And all of these teams are coming together around common decarbonization goals and initiatives that are now a business priority. So super interesting. I think it's also important to note that there is a wide disparity because while there are 37% of respondents with 10 or more, there's also 32% of respondents with 1 to 3 folks who are engaged in decarbonization. So there's still a good number of organizations who have a small and mighty team that are trying to tackle these really big, hairy goals. So I think that's important to note.
Fantastic. And I think that gives a very good sort of boots on the ground level of what's going on. I included this data, which is essentially looking at governance initiatives for decarbonisation, to flip that on its head and look a bit top down. If you ask CEOs and boards what's going on and when are these sort of governance initiatives at the very senior levels been implemented, we see actually quite a strong level of maturity for that. When we did the survey 3 or 4 years ago, the picture was very different. Over half of firms saying they have a dedicated team for key climate targets, which most likely encompasses those employees referenced on the previous slide. But we also see executive remuneration. We see some firms establishing an internal carbon price, although that's very difficult these days. We have KPIs for executives to get their nice bonus. I think what's really interesting here, though, is that ultimately, if you're going to decarbonize, you essentially need to deploy capital to do that. You need to manage capital expenditure on projects. And for me, the most interesting thing here is how that funding is getting organized. We see 30% of firms already have dedicated resources attached for this. And very much, 35% anticipate that to occur in 2025. So I think what we're looking at here is a shift in how decarbonisation is managed internally. There are more employees operating in it, but from a top-down level, there's more executive interest. They work out how to earmark funds to do this and ultimately improve performance. The narrative that's starting to build here is that firms are looking to actually invest in operations to decarbonize. And there are obviously co-benefits for that: energy efficiency, lowered costs, etc., etc. And that's a very different sort of scenario than when we're talking about the old school, let's be net zero by 2050 and altruistic sort of business giving back, which is almost a hangover of the old school CSR, corporate sustainability and doing good days. Is very much an operational and performance related concern.
And that's exactly the same trend we're seeing from our survey result a few months ago. Scope 1 and 2, and specifically, facility operations are becoming the focus. So from our report, we found that Scope 1 and 2, so specifically direct and energy-based emissions, are the top priority, with 68% of survey respondents listing that as their priority initiative. That is a 22% point increase from the previous period. So we're seeing that on the rise, which we love to see. And then also over half of these folks are tracking their major energy usage, which is an 11 percentage point increase, or 11 percentage point increase from the previous period. So lots going on in Scope 1 and 2. And what we're seeing is, while in Scope 3, we did see a period over period increase in priority, or of what they're tracking. However, it's still nowhere near as much as Scope 1 and 2. So it's really the next frontier. But I think also what we're hearing from Connor's results is that because the compliance doesn't always require Scope 3 or has limitations to Scope 3, we're seeing that shift to the focus on Scope 1 and 2. So really, really interesting trends.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you talk about Scope 3. I think it's as a concept, it sounds nice, right? Let's reduce our supply emissions. And I think many firms genuinely do want to, but really the carbon calculation based off the GHG protocol, firms don't have the mechanisms to do it. Regulators don't have the mechanisms to understand where does one firm's operational control begin, the other cease. We see some difference in that, looking at sort of product level initiatives, right? And obviously energy itself is essentially a subdivision of Scope 3, but very much firms are hunkering down in the bunkers and looking at making their own operations decarbonized, for a variety of reasons. And that really comes to on this slide, right? We ask executives, what are you prioritizing with regards to decarbonization here? And for me, the important stuff here is efficiency, right? Building energy efficiency, plant energy efficiency, and accompanying electrification ambitions there. Why is that the case? Well, it's a two birds, one stone situation here. You're more efficient, you're using less resources. It's a very easy business case to make from a purely financial perspective, but then obviously that impacts your emissions. And I think for me, most importantly, it's in your own locus of control as a business. It's up to you. You can always, unless you're a tenant with a very strict landlord, you can optimize your buildings. You can do work on it. You can invest capital and see a return. We're definitely seeing some elements of, let's say, indirect climate action, such as buying carbon offsets, which you can see there at the bottom, dropping in priority. Buying an offset is essentially a pure CapEx decision. You're not getting any sort of ROI beyond reputational benefit on that. Now it's a bit different when you get to renewable energy, as you can see there, smack bang in the middle, still a priority across businesses and firms, to sort of account for the residual emissions that you can't take care of. And even the most energy efficient electric building ultimately needs renewable energy. So we're seeing very much a focus on Scope 1 and 2 from a reporting and target perspective, and that's filtering down into which initiatives and interventions are ultimately being financed. Next slide, please, Amber. And in terms of looking at how some of this impacts the structure of the actual operational teams, ultimately with decarbonisation, right, the top-down committees and net zero teams and decarb teams, they're never going to have the primary burden and responsibility for implementing decarbonisation initiatives, right? They're going to be reporting, they're going to be allocating capital, they're going to be talking to stakeholders and investors. But ultimately, if you need to decarbonize a building, it's the facilities manager, it's the energy procurement team, et cetera, who will actually make that a reality. And so we're very interested here at Verdantix at looking at that intersection between what was very much a reporting investor relations and sustainability team issue and the actual operational teams. And what we see is a high degree of convergence between those two. We see that operations teams are, if not always, aligned on the firm's climate goals. They're very strongly aware of them. They have a very important part to play in terms of providing carbon-related data for reporting efforts and for ultimately for target setting. And you also see some of the KPIs filtering down. What's really significant to note here is that rather than, although the survey might say they provide data, I think it's more accurate to say that the operations teams, especially in certain assets, industrial plants, buildings, etc., really collect, gather, monitor, and then move the data upwards for reporting. So they bear a lot of onus on ensuring data quality and ultimately ensuring that whatever interventions are financed, LED lighting, a heat pump, etc., actually work smoothly. Next slide, please, Amber. But I think despite what we've seen here, we've talked a lot about how the patterns of decarbonisation are changing from purely reporting and target setting to trying to embed it in operations. Realistically, it's very challenging and firms face significant challenges on this. What we didn't ask here is cost, right, and justifying that. I think if we did, that would probably be the #1 challenge, but it doesn't make for an interesting chart. There's lots of issues here. It's not like operational teams and senior executives are aligned on how decarbonisation activities should happen. Realistically, operations teams have got their own day job to worry about, right? Which very rarely, even though they massively impact the climate direction of the company, that's not in their primary remit, right? The facilities manager has to make sure the building's running and operating as an asset for the building, and then climate comes second. And then there's also a lot of inherent issues relating to best practice and organizing this. We see lack of climate related subject matter expertise. How many teams have got a consistent presence of climate experts across all their departments? Very few. We still do see some instances of low CEO engagement. Not every CEO, and very few, I would say, are prioritizing decarbonisation over the basic business fundamentals and business issues, which defines the operation of the business and the economy. And of course, some of the most important ones here is the incentivization of division leaders. You have to essentially take a hit on productivity. You have to spend capital. You have to potentially disrupt works if you're retrofitting a building to ultimately improve climate performance. And that's a significant financial burden on firms. Next slide, please, Amber. So this fairly complicated slide is something I use as a sort of a proxy to talk about how complicated it is to manage emissions data and understand where you are as a firm and how to allocate capital. On the left, we have data collection processes, right? If you're carbon accounting, you're trying to work out your performance, you essentially have to take operational data from plenty of different sources, whether that's facilities management, BMS solutions, HR, product level, supply chain, etc., etc. And whatever software platform all that is in, you essentially have to take it into your carbon management solution, apply emissions factors, do carbon accounting. Not too exciting, but that gives you an idea of your performance. That is a very difficult process. That requires cross-functional collaboration. That's not something that can be done at scale on Excel. But I think a lot of firms justified doing it on Excel when all they were doing was an annual sustainability report, right? Which is very much a do-good, altruistic exercise. If you are trying to either report some of this stuff in a regulatory or mandatory context, or B, trying to actually work out where your emissions are, what the most ROI effective use of capital is to try and reduce some of those emissions, a manual or non sort of integrated approach to this doesn't really stack up anymore. It's not going to pass a CFO saying let's build some wind turbines unless you can work out why they're going there, how much it's going to cost, and how many years the payback period will be. So this is a functional look at carbon accounting, but what it actually shows is some of the complexities of organizational collaboration, capital allocation, and ultimately some of the inherent issues in carbon management, which makes Scope 3 a massive concern.
Spot on. Yeah, and we at EnergyCAP really believe, we've been doing this for 48 years, and our lens on the world of decarbonization is that you can't monitor what you can't measure. And so data is really the foundation to get you to a place where you're able to accurately report on your decarbonization initiatives. And that is really where we come in. EnergyCAP is a software platform that serves as a single source of truth for all of your energy, sustainability, utility data in one pane of glass. And what we do is we bring teams together and we bring data together, and we bring those teams together around that common data. So everything from your energy consumption, from bill data to interval data from your BMS systems, like Connor mentioned, to your facility specific information, utilization of those facilities, square footage, floor area, to operational data, including hours of operation and occupancy, transportation metrics, scope 3, and supplier impacts. All of that data can come into one place where you can start, to your point, Connors, we didn't talk about this, but justifying decarbonization and justifying the cost of it, right? Like you can actually decarbonize your operations and save money. It's a win-win, and we help our customers do that all the time. And that's where an energy management platform like EnergyCAP really comes in to not only support you as you're decarbonizing, but also help you save money along the way. So this is a slide that I love to show that really highlights the levers that you can pull with or without software to decarbonize your operations. And then across the top is kind of how we at EnergyCAP support our customers throughout that decarbonization journey. So on the left, you see, you're tracking your energy and your carbon emissions annually, and you should assume some business growth every year. And then what are the levers that you can pull to decarbonize each year? There's energy efficiency, there's electrification, various capital projects. What is your renewable mix? How are you tackling scope 3? And then at the end of the day, offsetting the rest. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. This is what we're all doing. And I think what's really interesting is people jump in at different steps, right? Like maybe you're really focused on renewables, but you haven't done a lot of electrification or energy efficiency projects yet. And that's okay. But I think the important thing to note is that you really do need data along this entire journey to help you prove the ROI so that you can continue to get funds to invest in additional projects, but also to help you track your decarbonization metrics. So that's exactly what we do. We help our customers in the front end identify and collect all of that information, which is kind of, if you flip back to Connor's slide, everything here on the left, that data collection piece, we streamline that. So imagine, being able to log into a platform and seeing all of your energy, sustainability, and utility data in one place and not having to manage spreadsheets. That's where we can step in and really help in the front end. And then once you have that data and you feel really good about that baseline, you can start to activate projects. That's the green bar here where we jump in and we're able to help you identify areas for opportunity to reduce consumption or reduce energy consumption across different parts of your organization, whether you've got a building that's an energy hog or a specific boiler that you need to replace. And we can also help you track those projects and track the return on investment of those projects over time. And that's where the verification comes into play, or with M&V. And then from there, we're able to help you report and socialize that data. That's one of the most important parts. I think reporting is, for the sake of reporting to different carbon emissions platforms, is interesting. But what we really focus on too is being able to report to internal stakeholders, being able to show, here's the energy projects that we activated this quarter, this year, and here's the return we're already starting to see on those projects. That's really going to help you get more funding for additional projects down the line. And with that, that's a little bit about who we are, but I want to open it up to questions. If we have any, feel free to drop them into the chat. And while we're waiting, I do want to highlight, this slide looks a little weird, but if you like this webinar and you want to get more content from us, feel free to join our mailing list. So scan this QR code into your email, and we'll continue to send you our monthly webinars as well as other content. And this specifically the State of Decarbonization report, our most recent report, we'll send to you first. And while we're waiting for questions, I just want to open it up to you, Connor. As we go into 2025 and beyond, what are some of the trends that we should expect, or what are some maybe predictions you have for this space as we head into the next year?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I alluded some general trends, predictions, I guess, on a macro scale throughout the webinar. I think a few really big things are coming along the line. I think the impact of the CSRD is going to be very interesting. I don't think it's CSRD in the UK, in the EU, 50,000 firms are going to have to report to it, right? Many of which are located outside of the EU, including in the US, but have significant operations there. So many of the largest American firms are going to have to disclose. What's interesting in that is that, for me, it provides a database of emissions data, which is unparalleled, right? You have 50,000 firms all reporting in the same format, context, XBRL tags, so machines can read it in the same way as a financial report, subject to some level of assurance. I think that's going to be really interesting in terms of resetting everyone's expectations on what emissions should be, what's realistic, and establish a baseline for performance, which I think has been lacking, right? Everyone reports emissions differently. Everyone reports it using different emissions factors. It's very difficult to get on board with that when you're not sure if your competitors or yourselves are doing it the same way, if it's comparable. So therefore, how do you justify progress? So I think that's a really big one. I think the second one is we're going to see a massive paradigm shift in terms of target settings. Next year's 2025. That's symbolically and realistically halfway towards that 1.5 degree scenario, which we've already failed, right? We're going to see, I think, a lot of actual target setting based on investment in terms of into assets. You see, for example, Microsoft over in the States investing huge amounts of money in renewable energy projects. I think we're going to see lots of firms saying, okay, here's our emissions. How are we contributing in the fight against climate change? Here's our investment plan in terms of renewable energy, electrification, heat pumps, etc., building the grid to contribute towards decarbonization, rather than we're going to be 30% net on the way to net zero by whichever year. And those are two major ones in my perspective. Beyond that, I think looking forward even further, I think we're going to see a massive shift in terms of which teams and digital approaches to climate change and carbon management specifically. I don't think having a standalone carbon management platform, as most players and as most firms do, operating as this data management and reporting layer is really feasible anymore. I think you're going to see carbon management being integrated within operational platforms, specifically those which manage your assets, whether that's BMSs and various energy management utilities. If you're more in the sort of heavy industrial asset space, maybe within your asset investment and planning software, asset maintenance. And that's a sort of shift that forward thinkers and people perhaps looking to buy a solution should be aware of.
Yep. I think that's spot on, especially as we see this shift kind of back towards operational efficiency. I think it's unique for EnergyCAP. And I'll just give us like a selfish plug. That's really one of our big differentiators is that we do utility, energy, and carbon reporting and data management. And there's not a lot of companies out there that do that. And so I think that's a really interesting point, that it's going to shift back a little bit. We did get one question from Robert Laud. Thank you for the question, Robert. Has EnergyCAP seen clients receive custom incentives with U.S. utility providers from using your energy management platform? That's a great question. I don't know for sure, but what I can tell you is that we partner with a lot of utilities directly who have specific compliance needs from their state government to report to Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and we support the utilities directly with their connecting their large power buyers' data to Energy Star. And there's a lot of benefits to utilities partnering with us directly because it helps them understand, demand and load, and helps their large power buyers also understand where they have opportunities to decrease that load, right? So yes, we also work with a lot of direct end users who don't get incentives necessarily from the utility providers, but who use EnergyCAP to apply for grants to support their energy efficiency projects. We have a really great story with the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, who used EnergyCAP utility management, smart analytics, which is our interval data solution, and our carbon accounting solution to do an analysis on their central plant, which was like 50, 60 years old, and they needed to basically tear it down and rebuild that plant. And they used EnergyCAP data to help explain the problem of how this plant is over consuming and it's not efficient, and also model what a new plant and new assets that they would bring in, what would be the carbon impact, what would be the energy impact and the cost reduction impact of installing a new plant, and when they would see the payback. So they used our data to model and apply for that grant. So there's stories of that where you can use the data as a baseline to really build a business case for projects. And we've also seen like that most of our customers see about 10% a decrease on their utility bills annually, just by using our data to flag anomalies and identify areas for operational improvement, see when they're, prevent late payments on bills, all of those things. We have a different report that we did where we surveyed customers and they shared how they find cost savings with EnergyCAP, which we're happy to share with you, Robert. But that is it. That's all the questions we have for today. Obviously, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to ping me directly on LinkedIn, add me. I'd love to connect. And I just want to thank you, Connor, for your time today. And
thank you, Amber. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for joining the conversation. And we'll see you at the next LinkedIn Live. Thanks all.